So in a lot of cases, the challenge wasn't as much about the volume of data, it was about finding and using the data that you needed.
Is it actually dead?
It did not happen overnight. Some of the use cases that we think about today in using the internet and mobile phones, who would have thought about before, except for the science fiction writers?
The bigger question is, how are we using the information that we have to make good business decisions?
Lean in, understand where your industry specifically at your level of play is leveraging it, and then get in the game. Hello everyone, and welcome to TechCentric, your one-stop shop for understanding how tech and your business relate. I'm your host, Chris Moniz, and today we have Jeremy Grunwald, a longtime solution designer in both the application and data space. We also have Carlos Cruz, a seasoned data strategist and data governance expert. And finally, we have Matt Gordon, a tenured data architect, a Microsoft Data Platform MVP, and an author on books on cloud migrations and AI technologies. On today's episode, we answer the question, what the heck happened to big data? And if you've been asking yourself that question, you are not alone. However, before we try to answer that question, we kind of need to define what big data was. So I'm going to start out with you, Jeremy, and ask that question. What was big data?
Well, we have to think back to before big data when it was just, small data. We had constrained bandwidth, we had dial-up internet. Even when we had, DSL and that sort of thing, we were used to limits on our email sizes and that sort of thing. And then gradually over time, tools like Google Maps came out, which I vividly remember, being kind of groundbreaking. We all of a sudden there was an explosion in the amount of information, and people needed to find ways to solve it. And this was pre-cloud, so you were dealing with lots and lots of commodity hardware, and technologies like Hadoop came out. And Hadoop is a bit of an old-fashioned word now, and maybe even a little bit of a bad word now, depending on who you talk to. But it was a great idea in the sense of using commodity hardware to distribute all the little bits of information instead of trying to store it all in one place, and then gather that information back together when somebody needed to retrieve it and do something with it. So big data became a big thing. It became a big buzzword because there were so many new opportunities to do things with the information out there, from geographic stuff like Google Maps, like we said, audio, video, YouTube, Netflix came out, etc. And suddenly, enormous amounts of data were everywhere. The challenge is, it kind of wore itself out a bit because Hadoop was sold as the answer to all the world's problems, whether they involved big data or not. And people spent a lot of time and a lot of money, building out their farms to deal with all of this data. And some companies really needed it, and some of them really didn't. And at the same time that all of that was happening, infrastructure was advancing, right? We didn't have to worry about dial-up internet anymore, DSL, et cetera. And so it's been kind of cyclical since then, to think about the way that we think about data today, which is sometimes we don't think about it at all because our bandwidth is, readily available, and our computers have much bigger hard drives, and everything's in the cloud now.
So you mentioned some players there. You mentioned Hadoop, and yeah, I'm curious. I heard Netflix and everything else. Are those the only folks that were using big data? I mean, were there other types of companies using this stuff, or was it basically those large technology firms?
Oh, I was just using those as examples, but lots and lots of companies realized that they were outstripping their supply of storage, for the kinds of information that they needed to deal with. So in a lot of cases, it was just documents, right? Everybody used, intranets, SharePoint, shared drives, etc. And a lot of that stuff started to pile up, especially the larger firms that deal with things like accounting and legal documentation, technology documentation, etc. I did mention, YouTube. There were podcasts started. Anyone who was dealing with large amounts of information, and pretty quickly that became almost everyone. Almost every company is dealing with large amounts of information, especially because it gets produced faster than it gets cleaned up. So in a lot of cases, the challenge wasn't as much about the volume of data, it was about finding and using the data that you needed. And that's where I mentioned Hadoop as a specific company with a specific technology, but a lot of tools out there all kind of borrowed that same concept of distributing the information, keeping track of where all of it is, and then using programs that knew how to go out, find and collate and collect the information that you were looking for without constantly having to prune it and get rid of stuff that you didn't need anymore, which face it, we're all lazy. We we rarely think about cleaning up our old documents and things, and in the moment, I just want to find the thing that I'm looking for.
So if people want to know who to think of if they look back and they try to remember their life back when all this started, which speaking of which, I mean, anybody, when did this all start? When was the advent of big data? How far back are we talking here?
And so that you can argue about that. If you Google it, lots of things will say around 2006, because like some technologies that formed the foundation of that started to be invented or created in the open source space, things like that. But like anything on on the internet, you can find a variety of opinions on when it was and when its heyday was, and even what its status is now. But yeah, early aughts, I think we're supposed to call it mid aughts. But again, that's very debatable.
I'm dating myself a little bit, but I was working as a developer at the time, building websites, corporate internet kind of information, programs that were being used internally. And we were using a technology referred to as Ajax, which was JavaScript and XML technology. It was before webhooks, etc., that would allow you to imagine this, load more information into a web browser without reloading the page, which became today's infinite scroll. And that's why I brought up Google Maps, because that sticks out in my mind as right around that 2006 period, Matt, when we'd been using Ajax internally for a little while, and then all of a sudden was this killer app that used it so that you could scroll around a map and not have to keep reloading the page to see the next piece. And I think that drove a lot of this appetite, right? The infinite scroll of Facebook, the just the sheer volume suddenly exploded because people got used to being able to, virtually sort of turn their heads and see more information.
Well, and I think that's also when a lot of companies started to look at data as a product, because you've got social media kind of coming to the, if not the forefront, definitely being on a lot of people's radars, or starting to be, and then companies kind of picking up on that. And it's like, well, okay, we have all this tracking information from our website or from our social media site or whatever. We need to gain insights off that, or we need to turn it into a product and sell it to people who are going to gain insights off it. So I think there started to be a high demand for technologies like this. It's like, we know we have to store a bunch of data, and then from that data, we're gonna have to find some things out about it pretty fast, come up with something to do that.
That brings to mind, right? We can't forget about Amazon at that time, right? Amazon was a
Yeah.
bookstore once upon a time. And as they started selling more and more stuff and gathering more information about products, about people, about the customers, about shipping, about all of those things, they built all this infrastructure behind the scenes. And now Amazon Web Services, which leverages all of these big data concepts, is bigger than Amazon, the retailer itself.
Yeah. Well, what occurs to me is what I remember from back in that time was companies like uh, Cloudera and Hortonworks were sort of the original companies that were formed to try to take advantage of what was effectively an open source thing. And you don't really hear about them anymore. I mean, are they even still around?
Cloudera and Hortonworks merged, I believe. I don't recall the exact year, but I remember, you'd see them individually sponsor at like data conferences and things like that, and then they were together. I think it was like 2017 or 2018, but when I was kind of doing some reading about this topic, it seems the consensus is that that's round about the time big data started to fade from favors, like 2017, 2018. You had two of the major players consolidate, and I wasn't at a shop where we were using those products then, but I would imagine, as usually happens when that happened, probably pricing went up. There were some other technological advancements that maybe made this type of infrastructure a little less interesting, and so they tried to capitalize on a market that was starting to shrink, but they didn't know that yet. Yeah, whether I don't actually know if they still exist. I would assume they do in some fashion, but I don't know.
I know Cloudera does, but that's because I know a lot of my clients are trying to get off of Cloudera and stop paying those licensing fees and those infrastructure fees. So that's how I know that they're still around. Um, but Matt, you raise an interesting point, right? The sort of interaction of technology and infrastructure, small scale and large scale, had a big impact here, right? Tools like Hortonworks and Cloudera, et cetera, were all designed to be used on premises. People were reacting to the fact that they kept having to buy more servers, right, with more server licenses and things. Well, around the time that you're talking about is when AWS and then Azure became things, and again, the broadband made it possible to not have to own your own servers and your own infrastructure to keep track of large amounts of data. There were other companies out there that were better suited to do that for you. It took a while for anyone to trust that. It took a while for us to get to the point where everyone was online all the time. So I remember a period where we were talking to our customers about the cloud, and they said, "But what about when I'm on a train? Or what about when I'm on an airplane? How am I going to get to my applications and my documents?" But time marches on, and solutions are found to problems like that.
Yeah, and these were not simple environments to keep running either. And I talk about them in the past tense, but like I know places that still use this stuff, so it's not they haven't ceased to be.
Mhm.
But you needed some specialized skills on your admin team to kind of care for and feed these things, and not everybody had those. And so yeah, then you started to see these kind of offerings in the cloud. It's like, oh, you want this, but it's a pain to keep running, or you don't want to add a bunch of people to do this. We'll just spin it up in our cloud, and we'll kind of take care of that for you. So that was awfully inviting to some folks who probably got tired of either the environment going down a lot, or why are you telling me I need a bigger team to run the thing that we used to run it with three. Why do we need five? It's like, well, the stuff's grown. There's more to keep track of, so we need more folks. For a lot of executives, that probably got old.
But I will say the one thing I saw a lot of back then was it was not just I had three and now I need five. It was I had three and now I need at least five, and half of them, the prices they're asking for are crazy. I mean, it's why didn't you tell me it would be that expensive to find skill to maintain this thing? And it was very pricey. And last I knew, still was. I mean, just anybody who gets into that space can demand quite a hefty fee because it's rare. It doesn't. We don't have a lot of people that do it.
And I think it was around the same time that you had people realizing that, trying to make Hadoop do everything, create data warehouses, leveraging Hadoop and MapReduce and stuff like that, just really wasn't practical. It wasn't designed to do that, and trying to force it to do something that it just wasn't designed for really led to a lot of bad juju around big data, so to speak. And that's probably why, for lack of any better word, like it began to die, big data. And more modern technologies that leverages a lot of the same concepts, like distributed computing, separate compute and storage and stuff like that, were coming out that still leveraged, oh, ANSI SQL, right? You can still search for, you can search for your data in a better way than having to write scripts using technologies that nobody knew.
That's a good point. And I think it kind of it brings us to sort of the next big question I wanted to ask. So, is it actually dead, or is it just different now?
For me, it's just different now. Um, we're still using a lot of those concepts like we just talked about. They haven't gone anywhere. And I don't think we want to get too deep nerd wise in this, but like architectures shifted from what those were to kind of what you're looking more like Databricks, Snowflake, Fabric. That's kind of where we're at. They've started to make big leaps in performance and all those sorts of things, while also, really kind of maturing those cloud-based big data solutions where it's like, hey, we'll take care of it all. It's managed. But oh, by the way, there's all this stuff you also have to do alongside of us, where this stuff really does just spin up and largely take care of itself. That's very attractive to a lot of firms, and one could argue they might even overpay for that because it's convenient. You don't need a bunch of people to maintain that. It's just I need a warehouse of size whatever, and you hit a few buttons and spend a little money and it's there. That's really when those tools, maybe if they didn't grow into their own, like that's when you started to hear about Snowflake and things like that. And I feel like they kind of kicked off the next evolution in this stuff and really started the arms race we're in now.
Well, and that's Matt, that's how I tend to explain it to people an awful lot when they're asking about tools like Snowflake or Microsoft Fabric or even what Databricks is doing now. It's conceptually the same. It's conceptually the same with MapReduce and Hadoop and all the stuff from 15, 20 years ago. The ideas were good ideas, just the way they were implemented, has evolved. It was a pain to deal with. It was expensive to deal with, etc. But the concepts were great. Like Carlos said, the concepts of distributed computing, sharding the information across commodity storage, all of that stuff is happening behind the scenes, under the covers. When you use Snowflake as an example, it is doing the exact same thing, just using their own proprietary approach that's a little bit more efficient, and they're hiding it behind comfortable, familiar interfaces so that you don't need to worry about it.
No,
This is going to
yeah.
sound like a very silly analogy, but I talk to my customers on a fairly regular basis about, think about utilities. There was a time when everybody had their own well for water in their backyard or had their own windmill for, energy. And we hit the point where we outsource that now because it's become commoditized. There are organizations that are much better situated to specialize and handle that for us, and we just get to use it now. We don't have to think about all of those bits of storage and plumbing.
Well, and what's funny is, so like I asked Copilot the other day, like tell me about the relationship between Microsoft Fabric and Hadoop. And what it came back with is telling me that in Data Factory, there's an HD Insight MapReduce activity that you can use. So it's definitely not dead. It's dead-ish, but there's enough demand for it that even the shiny new thing is, oh, by the way, buried on this docs page somewhere deep. You can use that old stuff if you want, and here's the 10-step guide on how to. I felt like that was really interesting. I was expecting your typical kind of AI generated philosophical answer, and it's like, oh, you must mean this old page that's over here.
But I need to ask a follow-up on that, Matt. So as the resident, Microsoft Data Platform MVP, is there kind of a straight line from Hadoop to HC Insight to Azure Delta Lake to Fabric? I mean, are they pretty much, parent-child relationships and evolutionary generations, or is it not that straightforward?
For me, it's not that straightforward, and at the risk of starting an argument on the internet, which rarely happens, so that's good. Um, it's kind of fits and starts. Like there were, not to get too deep into kind of the history of what Microsoft was doing in this space, but some of these ideas they started working on before the other went away at all. Some of these ideas never really got maybe the love and support that they needed. Like I knew a lot of people that were excited about HD Insight. They were working in that space, like, oh, great, here's this cloud-based offering that's going to let me do all kinds of this stuff and more. I can use Spark in there and all that. And they never were really satisfied with where the product went. So it's kind of in very typical Microsoft fashion. They always get it right, but sometimes it takes a couple generations of, if not getting it wrong, getting it sideways to be like, no, okay, well, we thought that was a good idea. It was okay, but really it needs to go this way. So it's not a straight line. I would argue it was kind of this with a couple kind of off and on ramps too. So it would look like a straight line if I tried to draw it in front of a crowd.
Okay. So, last question around this area, and this is open to anybody. Again, the point of this is we're trying to talk and help folks who are, executives in their business lives trying to understand what is this area. I used to hear big data. I remember the hype cycle that went with it, and it looked like it fell off a cliff and disappeared. But I still hear people talking about how data is table stakes. So help me understand. What should I care about? Who are the players today that I should be looking for? And, what are they going to do for me versus what is the stuff that I might want to potentially avoid because they are potentially on a hype cycle right now that I might want to wait and see on?
I'll let Matt and Jeremy talk about the players and the technologies. What I would say to executives who are wondering around, what happened to big data is, data, whether it's big or small, continues to evolve and will forever evolve. What we choose to focus on or what we need to focus on or what industry deems to call those focus areas, big data, whatever it is, will change based on business need, and also based on technical innovation. We've talked about some of that already today, right? So to me, big data didn't go anywhere, but as a name, as a term, for lack of a better word, it got boring, right? We solved a lot of it. We got to the business of moving beyond the hype to solving for big data better. We adapted the concepts like we talked about, right? From Hadoop into today's modern data architectures and made managing and using big data more practical, right? It was a nightmare trying to do a lot of things in Hadoop or, in some of those in Cloud Air, Hortonworks, whatever, trying to, again, make those into data warehouses. I'm like, what are you people doing? When that was happening, right?
Yeah.
So I think our ability to manage big data, though, so moving on past that, right? So we got good at a lot of that stuff, right? And you're going to have to forgive me for the slight tangent into AI, right? But, our ability to do big data better positioned us for what is the next, or maybe current big thing, right? Which is AI. We're in the middle of this platform shift into AI, well, more particularly generative AI, right? Is in my opinion, it's a platform shift akin to big data, or even more so, like akin to the birth of the internet, right? So, what do I mean by platform shift? What I mean is, when I say that, I mean a fundamental change in the way that we interact with the world, with data and with each other, right? So some things to think about, platform shift is a changed and an associated evolution, right? So think about the internet. I said that, right? I'm old enough to remember a world without the internet, without instant access to, well, just about everything, right? In today's world, you can get to everything. The way we consume, information, the way we communicate with each other, entertainment, how we get goods. We already talked a little bit about, Amazon, right? Even to how we get food. Like everything changed since the early 90s because of the internet. It changed how we interacted with the world, right? And that led even to more fundamental change with the rise of the mobile infrastructure and mobile data. And now everything that we used to do in front of a desk or that we had to go to a store for, we can do wherever we are, because, it's kind of quaint. We still call these phones, right? They're not phones anymore, right? This is the world in your hand. So, bringing that back to big data, right? Sure, is the nom de jour, it's dead, right? But as a practical concept, it's alive. So if you think about those 5 V's of big data, right? Volume, velocity, variety, value, veracity. I would argue that the technology of today has pretty much solved for the volume and velocity parts of it, right? We've talked about that, right? Where we're headed with AI, where we're headed in the new world and with the platform shift, is we need to focus on variety, right? So unstructured data, which Hadoop was really good at, is something that we still have not been doing a lot of in modern architectures, modern data architectures. I'm going to put it that way, right? So being able to really manage and govern unstructured and semi-structured data is something we need to think about moving forward in the world, right? That's what executives should be thinking about. Veracity. The importance of veracity never changes. Garbage in, garbage out arguably becomes even more important in the world of AI, because you're just going to get really bad answers really fast. And if you're going to automate based on that stuff, you're going to get really bad decisions, bad actions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly,
the air here.
sorry. And then lastly, value, right? So I'm sorry, I'm pontificating. I am on my soapbox. Value, right? So people are talking a lot about where are we going with AI. You know, AI is the next big thing. It's the great thing, right? I would posit that we've only scratched the surface of what the value proposition for AI and generative AI is, right? The use cases and the value proposition of generative AI is going to evolve as the platform evolves and grows, right? So if you think back to what we're talking about with the internet and mobile data and mobile computing, all that stuff is platform building to what we can do today. It did not happen overnight. Some of the use cases that we think about today in using the internet and mobile phones, who would have thought about before? Except for the science fiction writers, right? So, like, Gene Roddenberry, heck yeah, he knew, right, what was coming. But you know, I think most of the stuff we don't even have the slightest clue yet about what Gen AI is going to do for us,
Mm.
except in science fiction, right?
So that was
A
that
lot.
kind of jumped
There's a
ahead on
lot.
me. Well, I did want to go into, so where are we going? Because I think what I'm hearing here is, first of all, so the demise of big data has been largely exaggerated. It is not dead. It is just evolved, and quite a lot, frankly. I do like the reference of it hasn't gone anywhere. It just got boring because we figured it out, right? So now we were looking for the new thing to figure out. And I still come back to there was something that was said earlier in the conversation that the early the early generations of this were really, really hard. They were hard to maintain. I mean, I had to deal with some of that myself where it was when you had to build a cluster, you heard commodity hardware. And when you finally built it, you found out the hard way that, well, yeah, but if you wanted to perform with large amounts of data, you're not getting commodity hardware. And you were investing six, seven figures in hardware to make this thing really do what you wanted. And, you know, what what has changed to make it more adoptable? Because it occurs to me what you're effectively saying here is that technology got easy, it got cheap, and it got pervasive in everything that we do around data. It got synonymous with data. And how did it do that? How did it go from being as expensive and complicated as it was to being everywhere?
Well, and I think Carlos hit on a lot of it. I think we've talked about some of it, but there is this iteration that happens with technology. So we have an idea, we try a thing, it's difficult, right? Somebody figures out how to make that thing a little bit easier. Well, that gives us more ideas for different things that we can do that then become difficult. And then we figure out a way to make those things easier, et cetera, et cetera. So, my friends who play computer games a lot, for example, right? I used to build my own PCs and that sort of thing. And now the iPhone that I use is more powerful than the PCs that I used to buy. But if you want to play modern popular video games, you still have to invest in a pretty heavy duty, powerful rig, because there's this iterative flow that happens of, oh, we've got solid state hard drives and we've got faster processors now. That means we can make even cooler games. Well, now to play the even cooler games, now you're going to have to buy fancier computers to keep up. And I don't mean to make that sound like a negative. What Carlos was saying about AI and what we were saying before about big data, you've heard me say this 1,000 times. Instead of using the word data, think about the word information. Information has not gotten smaller, right? Big information did not go away. It has only gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and more widespread. There is more information than we know what to do with. And that infrastructure of that bandwidth is what made it possible to explode from what you could do in your data center to what you can do with all the information in the world. And so if you look at tools like the hype around AI and the things that AI can do, it is greedy for and produces enormous amounts of information. And so what we used to think of as big data so that we could do things like have infinite scroll in Google Maps is now bigger, exponentially bigger, thousands and thousands of times bigger information that's stored all over the world, so that we can pull all that information together and use it in innovative ways like generative AI that can have a conversation with you, or the kinds of ones that, create first. A couple of years ago, we were seeing the first really good AI generated images. Now we're seeing AI generated videos. And all of that is just bigger and bigger and bigger data. And I don't mean to minimize it. It's not just bigger data, but to Carlos's point, as the platforms become more capable, they open the doors to the ways that you can combine and reuse and reimagine the different technologies to do something more interesting. And in many cases, things that, to Carlos's point, we're not thinking about right now, right? What we thought we were going to use those mobile phones for is not what we ended up using mobile phones for. We had all kinds of predictions about, real time, people don't, I mean, FaceTime is popular, but, and we're on a video call right now, but that's not the primary usage. That's what everybody thought the primary usage was going to be. We'd be able to walk around and talk to people anywhere in the world. And now, if I call my daughter on the phone, I'm going to get yelled at. Why am I not texting or, using an app or something like that? Um, so, I think it's worth thinking about the fact that there's all these bits and pieces and tools and capabilities that are going to get combined and iterate in really interesting ways that we can only predict so much at this point. And I don't mean that to be a scary thing. It's probably not going to go in the direction that we think it's going to go, but it might do something much better and more interesting and more helpful than the things that we can easily imagine right now.
But all that data that feeds that has to be true. Going back to what we said earlier, like all this cool stuff, and there, like you said, there's going to be uses for this technology that we haven't thought of, but somebody out there's thinking of it right now. There's somebody in a market segment somewhere. It's like, I think I know what I'm going to do with this, and this is going to change the world, or at least part of it. But if that thing drives off data that where all the basics haven't been done, it's not clean, it's not true, um, that it's not going to reach any of the potential that it needs to be. Um, so yeah, I think for executives, I think that's something important to think about. Like, as cool as all this stuff is, and you should be thinking of stuff that people haven't thought of, what you can do with the data you have, and Gen AI on top of it and all of that. You can't leave the basics out of the equation.
Yeah, 100%. Couldn't agree with you more, Matt, right? You still got, whatever terms you want to use, blocking and tackling, diet and exercise, right? You got to do the fundamentals to get, to get the value of the cool, new, shiny new toy, right? So I get clients asking me all the time right now, are we behind? Are we behind? Um, my answer, okay, I'll give you the consultant answer. It depends, right? It depends on, like, do you want to be on the bleeding edge of Gen AI? Like, do you want to be the one who's pushing the curve, or pushing, or do you want to ride the wave, right? Most companies are going to ride the wave. Like, the world is going to ride the wave. So you're not behind if you want to ride the wave, in my opinion, right? But I will also say, right, there is a cautionary tale here, right? If you don't pay attention, if you don't work to get your data house in order,
You're gonna get
including
crushed by
both
the wave.
structured, including structured and unstructured data,
Yeah,
then when the wave comes, you're just going to get bowled over, right?
yeah. I mean, that's kind of the way I've thought of it. Because right, there's a lot of conversations I have at conferences and things like that. Like, oh, my company's not doing anything with AI. Are we behind? It's like, and I drive race cars once in a while, so I always think of things in terms of racetrack. I think in a lot of ways with Gen AI, we're still figuring out what the racetrack is. So it's hard to say that anybody's behind when we haven't exactly defined what the circuit looks like, but we are. And right, you want to be a part of that. And then when everybody figures out, okay, here's what the race is going to be, if your data is not ready to go, you're behind at that point. And that
I would
point's
just
going to
add
come
one
soon.
more. Yeah, I would just add one more thing to that. So is your data ready to go, right? And then Matt, there's what you said before about is it right, is it true, is another part of it. And who knows whether it's true? How do we know whether it's true? We hear the phrase data literacy a lot, and a lot of people think that data literacy refers to the ability to write a query or something like that. But it's really about fundamental understanding of facts, of numbers, of of the meaning of the information that you're seeing, right? Over 100 years ago, the quote, there are three kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. If you don't know what the underlying information is that led to that conclusion, you're in trouble. And the two funny stories I have about that, right? One is when ChatGPT first came out, one of our colleagues reached out to me and he said, "I'm out of a job. I just asked ChatGPT a question about a technological topic, and it gave me this wonderfully written answer that said it better than I ever could." And I said, "Right, but you know whether it's correct or not. You're not out of a job. It might be really good at spitting out words, but you have the experience and the knowledge to have any idea whether what it said was true." And I kind of chuckle about this. We used to do math by hand, and then we got calculators, and that made it much easier to get to the right answer faster. And then we got Excel, and that game made it much easier to get to the right answer of very complicated questions faster, or the wrong answer. It also made it easier to get to the wrong answer faster and make bad decisions, because we trust those tools a little more than we should and don't really use our critical thinking about it. So I know we've gone a bit off topic around the big data thing a bit, but if you want to know if you're behind, to Carlos's point and Matt, to your point, knowing what you need to know about your information. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. Knowing which information is trustworthy and which information isn't, and the sheer increasing volume of information and the speed with which we process it makes the outcomes, it makes that all the more important to get the kinds of outcomes that you're looking for. So back to Chris, your question about if I'm an executive, what do I think about? I wouldn't worry too much about who are the big players, which technology specifically do I need to think about. I mean, those are important decisions for how you spend your money as a CIO or whatever. But the bigger question is, how are we using the information that we have? How are we defining which information we have is worth using, is not worth using? How do we find out the difference? How are we going to use these tools to make good business decisions?
Yeah, I like that, and I want to go back to something before we close out here that you said, Matt. I loved that race and that racetrack analogy that you used, and something that came to mind was, yeah, we're trying to figure out what the racetrack looks like right now. But I would argue there's one piece of that analogy missing, and that is what race class are you in? Are you racing NASCAR, F1, IMSA? What is it? Because the reality is that depending on your point of view of which one of those is the tippy top of the food chain, and I'm not going to go into that
That's a
debate because I'll
different
get hurt.
podcast that I would
Oh
also
yeah,
like
that's
to
a
be on.
very different podcast. But take your argument, whatever it is, as to what the tippy top circuit is of racing globally, their investment levels and how on the bleeding edge, as you said, Carlos, they want to get as executives is a very different appetite than a small time rally circuit, right? There's a chasm between those levels of investment, those levels of interest in risk, and that applies across business, right? There are firms, very large firms, that leaned into big data very early on when it was still very technical and very engineering heavy, and they were multi-million dollar implementations, and some of them prospered as a result of that, and some of them tripped over themselves trying to make that investment and didn't make good use of it. But they tried, and they were in the big leagues and could do that. But the vast majority of organizations recognize that that's a little too rich for my blood and waited for the Snowflakes and the Microsofts of the world to make it simpler, to make it far more table stakes, to make it more cost appropriate, and to make it more broadly available for that middle of the road racing team. So they could then lean in. And the measure became, when that technology became reasonable for your tier of that racing circuit, you either leveraged it and won, or you didn't and you lost. And knowing when it becomes appropriate for your racing circuit is key.
Yeah, and I would take it one step further, Chris, as we think about back to the internet, back to the mobile internet, right, and smartphones and that sort of thing. Most of us aren't on a racing team at all. But the racing teams, all that technology that gets discovered and figured out makes its way into the cars that we drive on our interstate highways every day, right? Disc brakes came from racing. Traction control came from racing. Paddle shifters came from racing, and Matt
Mirrors.
knows far more about this
Yeah.
than I do.
Yeah.
Gears at all, right, Matt? Thank you. So I don't mean
Yeah.
to, I don't mean to minimize this, right? If you are the CEO of a technologically driven business, yeah, you might be, in the race game at a top level or at a mid level or at a hobby level. But if you're one of the thousands of businesses, in the country or in the world today, you're going to need to pay attention to what's going on in the racing game, at least a little bit, because it's going to make its way to you and be part of how you live your life. And that's where I think back to Carlos's point about the platform shift is where things really come in is it starts as these amazing technological advances, and then it just becomes part of how we drive.
And that's what happened to big data.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Great show, guys.
And thanks for stealing my exit, Carlos. I appreciate that. I mean, that is a great way to close it, because at the end of the day, what I think all of you are telling me is it didn't go anywhere. It's still here. It has made so many of the miracles that we're dealing with today possible. And the big lesson to executives out there that are trying to figure out where should they be going with it is lean in, understand where your industry specifically at your level of play is leveraging it, and then get in the game as effectively, as risk averse as you're comfortable with, and as cost effectively as possible, but get in the game. And the reason for that is, as you heard a lot on this episode, is AI is coming. And you hear a lot right now about Gen AI, and Gen AI is just a piece. Just like machine learning 10, 15 years before, it was just a piece. Natural language processing, it's just a piece. There's all kinds of components to AI. And what we're seeing right now with generative AI is it is the tip of a much larger iceberg. And it is all, as Jeremy said, very data dependent and very data heavy in terms of what it generates. And if you want to leverage it, you got to get into the data game first. If you want to keep the conversation going or suggest an idea for a future episode, please comment below. And as always, if you have a question for me or one of our guests, you can contact us directly via the contact information in the description below. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you in the next one.